Continued audio of the Brendan Dassey trial transcripts beginning on page 201. This is the Edelstein's cross-examination of Fassbender. So there were no forensic tests made at that time at that location, not to my knowledge. Were you present from the time that you got there and saw what was the secured or should have been the secured RAV4 until the time the vehicle was physically loaded up into the enclosed trailer? I was not present at the RAV4. No, I was on scene, but I was not present at the RAV4. All right. So if the lab personnel did anything beyond a visual inspection, you weren't there to see it? That's correct. But as lead investigator, you keep up with the things that the lab people do in the course of the investigation? I try to, yes. Well, that's kind of important, isn't it? Yes. In fact, a lot of times you have in conjunction with others involved, the authority to make specific requests of the lab for processing for evidentiary items? Correct. Attorney Edelstein: Your Honor, may I approach? No verbal response. By Attorney Edelstein: Agent, with respect to exhibit number 26, you saw it paraded in here earlier by two different law enforcement officers, right? Yes. And this is what you describe as the hood that was laying up against the RAV4? Yes. And I believe you testified in response to Mr. Kratz's inquiry that it was pretty heavy? Yes. And would you, in your opinion, you thought it would take two people to move it? Two people to easily manage it, I think it is how he asked the question, not just move it, but how to properly or easily manage it. Okay, so you're not suggesting to this jury that one person would be unable to move this about. No, I'm not. Have you ever picked it up? A couple days ago, last week I believe, I tried to pick it up and I can lift it. Okay, would it surprise you if I said I could lift it? If you can get your arms around it, no, it wouldn't. Okay, you got a little bigger wing. Yes. Span than I do? Yes. All right. So you, to the extent that one individual in otherwise relatively good health could move it, you wouldn't take argument with that, would you? No. Okay. You never weighed that, did you? No, I have not. Never asked the lab to weigh it, did you? I didn't ask them to weigh it. I don't know if they did. Did you ask them? I'm sorry. I did not ask them to weigh it. But it was taken to the lab? They took it with the RAV4, yes. And do you know, as part of your investigation in this case, being the lead investigator, there are no fingerprints on that matched Brendan Dassey, correct? Correct. You also know that there's no fluids of any type, no tissue of any type, no fibers of any type that are connected to Brendan Dassey, right? Related to that hood? Yes, sir. Correct. Let's go back for a second here to the RAV4. When you first got there, it's your understanding the vehicle was locked, right? Yes. And the purpose of having all these people there involved in this, and you described this as starting off as a missing persons type case, correct? Yes. Was there a reason why the RAV4 was not opened at that point if you're looking for someone who you're hoping is still alive? Because law enforcement officers looked in the windows of the RAV4 and did not see Teresa in the vehicle. Now, during the course of your direct exam, you described from the aerial photographs a line of vehicles and you testified that those were, quote, cars waiting to be crushed, right? You remember that? I remember that question being asked. I didn't necessarily agree that they were waiting to be crushed, but there's a line of vehicles along the back of the property. All right, so you don't have an opinion as to what the status of any of that particular vehicles of the 4,000 found on the property may have been on any given date during that 7-day period of time that police controlled the property? With exception of maybe some vehicles that were being prepared to be crushed, like in the shop or around the shop where they're getting items removed so they can be crushed, like gas tanks or whatever it has to be removed from a vehicle. Okay, and you are aware that in this type of business, certain items do have to be removed before they would properly be placed into the crusher, including things that hold fluids, for example, gasoline tanks? Properly, yes. Now, you testified, and correct me if I'm wrong, in response to Mr. Kratz's hypothetical that if Teresa's vehicle had ended up, shall we say, as a sandwich in between other vehicles that had been processed through the crusher, that it would have been difficult to locate the vehicle. Do you remember testifying to that? Yes, I do. Now, you've been an officer, what, 27 or so years? Correct. Okay, and when you showed us the pictures of the vehicles that had in fact been crushed, it's fair to say that it would be relatively easy to identify the color of the vehicle, would it not? Potentially, yes. And you tested, well, what do you mean potentially? When I looked at that, some vehicles you could clearly see the color and others maybe you couldn't. I mean, well, depends on the manner that it was crushed. Well, you testified that with the state troopers and the other volunteers, be they firemen or whoever, every single vehicle, including the squashed or crushed vehicles, had been examined. Yes. They took them apart, they uncrushed them, each vehicle, and looked at them. Well, did they uncrush them or did they simply separate them? Separate them. Okay. And opened them up. I'm sorry, and opened them up. This is Fassbender. If you want to call it uncrushed, if you want to say separated or opened. Okay, so obviously somebody had some equipment which was capable of, let's say that the roof had been flattened on a vehicle. Somebody had equipment to either enlarge it or remove it so as to be able to have a peek inside. The equipment was brought in. I know they were using the jaws of life on occasion to do some of that work. Okay. In addition to, and the purpose of course, of looking inside would be to see if there's any sign of human remains, correct? Correct. Okay. But to the extent that you testified it'd be difficult to locate, assuming you were able to determine a particular color, there are other methods by which you to determine the precise existence of a given vehicle besides the color, correct? Well, certainly. Attorney Kratz. Judge, I'm sorry. May I interpose an objection? Is he talking about a law enforcement officer with jaws of life or some citizen searcher? If he could be more specific with his questions. Attorney Edelstein. I can do that, Judge. The court. Okay, go ahead. Attorney Edelstein. Officers have access, if you will, to information to determine the identity of vehicles that the general public does not. Correct or incorrect? Well, with the internet nowadays, I don't know if that's necessarily true, but to run identifying numbers, correct. Through DOT, yes, we can do that. Okay, there's areas, be it on the frame, it might be different locations that are basically hidden intentionally by the manufacturer to assist in vehicle identification, right? Yes. Okay, so given that you have the ability to identify the hidden VINs and looking at colors, and do you still stand by your assertion that had this vehicle been in the middle of a crushed sandwich, so to speak, that it would have been difficult to locate? My response was just a visual observation. If someone was walking by or looking at those piles of cars, it would be difficult to locate. That was not with the understanding that I'm going to go and unsandwich the vehicles, tear them apart, and dig through them. Okay, so if it was just kind of a, correct me if I'm wrong, as I understand your testimony, you're saying if somebody simply does a sort of cursory walkthrough, you might miss it, it might be difficult to locate? I believe it would, yes. Okay. But if somebody takes the time to actually look carefully at each of the vehicles, including those that might be sandwiched, knowing things like color and age of the vehicle, it probably wouldn't have been that hard. It depends on the amount of work you put in. We brought a lot of equipment in and tore the vehicles open and apart to do that. It took almost a whole day. Now, you testified about creating these teams to do things on the 5th, following the search warrant for a protective sweep, correct? Yes. Did you decide who would be on these teams? I don't believe I was involved in the teams that went out and did the sweeps and the search for Teresa, the initial search. Were you when that occurred? Oh, no, I'm sorry. Where were you when that occurred? I was with the dog and the handler down by the RAV4, and then we continued searching along that line of cars and into an area in the Redant pit to the south of the Avery property. Going back to, I think it's 88, the hood over here, did you make any observations in the immediate area of the RAV4 to determine whether or not that hood came from anywhere close to that location? I did not. To your knowledge, did anyone else? I don't know. So you cannot tell us where, if at all, that may have come from before it was propped up against the RAV4? That's correct. And so I take it then you have no information relative to the whether or not there were any footprints in the mud leading up to the RAV4 that would have shown a path from the RAV4 to a location where the hood came from. That's assuming there's mud, and well, on the day that you were there, what was the condition of the ground? It was dry, at least most of the day, until the torrential rains started and wiped everything out. Is it fair to say that during the course of your involvement in the investigation, nobody produced any type of footprints in the junkyard area that connected to the shoe prints developed off the pattern of Brendan Dassey's tennis shoes? There were no footwear impressions obtained. So the answer to my question would be no. Thank you. The court. Counsel, before you go on, just to correct the record, I think you identified the hood as Exhibit 88, and it's really Exhibit 26. Attorney Edelstein. I'm sorry. The court. It's okay. By Attorney Edelstein. I believe you said, Mr. Fassbender, that the RAV4 was 350 feet from the crushing device? About 350. I think it was a little more than that, 360, 367, something like that. Is that a number that you personally arrived at, or is that a number you obtained from someone else? I believe that's a number obtained from Trooper Austin's measurements. Okay. Do you know, did he base that measurement as the crow flies, or based upon the distance one might have to travel from where it was, getting around a little watery depression area over by the crusher? My understanding is as the crow flies. Okay, well, realistically, nobody's going to go in a straight line from where the RAV4 was over to that crusher in 350 feet, would they? Correct. So when we talk proximity then, and you're talking about closeness to the crusher, it really was more than 350 feet you testified to. As a practical matter, if I were to walk it or drive it, it would be more than that. Okay. Agent Fassbender, you testified about Exhibit 60 and 59, right? Yes. You identified them as handcuffs? Yes. Where did 60 come from? If those were the two that were presented to me at the same time, I was unsure. I said that one pair of handcuffs came out of the Dassey Yonda residence, and one came out of Stephen Avery residence, I believe. All right. It is true, however, that neither one of the exhibits, be it 59 or 60, came from the bedroom area where Brendan Dassey lived or slept, correct? That's true. All right. Neither one of them came from an area that you would characterize as his area, his room? Correct. In fact, it's more accurate to say that both of them came from areas that were probably controlled or appeared to be controlled, one by Stephen Avery, one by his mother? Yes. When I speak of the mother, I'm talking about Brendan's mother, right? Yes. And that's how you understood the question? That's correct. We're not talking about Steve Avery's mother. No, I understood it to be Barb Taddick. Okay, again, 59 and 60. Whichever one came out of the Avery place, whichever one came from Barb's bedroom, they went to the lab, right? The ones out of the Yonda Dassey residence, I don't believe went to the lab. Well, not positive without seeing the paperwork or records. The ones from the Avery property, they obviously went to the lab? Yes. Not one shred of physical evidence on the handcuffs from the Steve Avery property connecting Brendan Dassey to those handcuffs. Correct or incorrect? Correct. No fingerprints? No. No DNA? There was DNA found on one of the sets of handcuffs that was male DNA, and it excluded Teresa Halbach but didn't exclude Stephen Avery. Did not in any way, shape, or form include Brendan Dassey. Correct? To my knowledge, no, without looking at the lab report. Okay, I realize there were a lot of evidence in this case, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but we all know it's very important, and the jury's entitled to know, right? Correct. Okay. If during the course of my exam, if there's something you're not sure about, you need to look at your notes, by all means, let us know, and we'll take a break, and we'll take a look at them. Let's talk about Exhibits 61 and 62. Again, where did these come from? Are there 3 sets of those behind that hood? No, sir. Just 2 sets of leg irons. Yes, sir. Those would have come out of Miss Taddick's bedroom. Both sets? Yes. Okay. I had testified that one set came out of Stephen Avery's house because I thought, as they were being brought up, I thought I had seen 3 sets. Okay. So being like any other human, any other officer, you make mistakes, right? Well, there was a pair of leg irons taken out of Stephen's house, and just the way they were brought up, I thought I had seen, because I saw 1 pair, and then 2 were brought up later, so I thought I had seen 3 sets of leg irons. I understand, but so you're attempting simply to correct what you told Mr. Kratz on direct? Yes. Which you acknowledged to this jury was an error? Yes. All right. And that happens because you're a human, right? Correct. Neither one of these, that being Exhibits 61 or 62, has any fingerprints on it that belong to Brendan Dassey, correct? Correct. Neither one of them has any DNA evidence connecting either one of these items to Brendan Dassey, correct? Correct. With the caution that I'm not positive they were processed. I'd have to look at the crime lab reports to make sure. Okay, well, if we take a break, you'd certainly do that for us, wouldn't you? And we'll revisit that when we get a chance. Certainly, if you'd like. I believe you testified about, and I can't recall the exhibit number, but it was one of the Austin depictions with the Avery garage roof removed. Remember that? Yes. And I believe you testified about 2 fragments of bullets that you believe were located within the garage, right? Yes, sir. Would you agree with me that the Austin depiction of that particular garage, to the extent that it does not include a great many items that were actually physically present at the time when you first got there,